The best Far Cry game ever made. That's what I've been hoping I can say about this game for about a year now. Ever since Far Cry 3, I've loved these games, but nothing has even come close to 3's fantastically well-written and performed villain Vaas, or its cohesion within the game world that reinforced all of the themes that were going on within the main narrative. But with this game, I knew that there was a chance we could have an upset. After all, Far Cry 6 is the hotly anticipated next entry in the long and storied franchise that has struggled with its identity over the last few entries. Once a grounded and gritty first-person shooter, the series has fallen victim to some of the populist tropes that have ruined so many intellectual properties before it. In recent years, Far Cry has given up many of the realistic mechanics that it used to present so proudly in pursuit of things like larger maps, more approachable gunplay, and repetitious gameplay structure that's useful for padding out gameplay time. But Far Cry 6 is Ubisoft's attempt at a return to form for the beloved franchise. They've focused on the writing, they've brought in A-list talent in the form of Giancarlo Esposito, and an active effort has been made to give all of the weapons a unique feel and style. But is it enough to make this game the best in the franchise, or does it fall flat once again? Let's get into it. As always, make sure to like the video and subscribe to be notified of the full 2-hour critique of the game that's coming in the next few weeks. Also, thank you to Ubisoft for getting me the review code a full week ahead of time. Let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start, because where the else would you start? That never made sense to me. You don't need to justify starting at the beginning. That's not novel or weird. Calm down, Julie Andrews. Jesus. I want to walk you through the first 20 minutes or so of the game, since it does a really good job of framing the rest of the experience and what it will be like. But feel free to skip to the next chapter, which I'll have marked out so you can avoid this discussion if you're worried about spoilers. But I assure you that this opening discussion won't ruin anything. Again, you'll experience it in the first 20 minutes of the game. First, it's important to understand that we play as Danny, a voiced protagonist that's been written as a truly original and self-driven character that actually has a personality and quality performance behind everything. This was an interesting change in direction compared to Far Cry 5. In that game, which I replayed a couple of months ago in order to prepare for this release, as I mentioned, the player character was just an empty husk with little to no personality at all. And that was done so that the player could project themselves onto the player character. However, this only works for some people, and it severely limits the quality of the interactions the other characters and NPCs can have with the player, because they're effectively acting off of an empty glass box. Thankfully, in Far Cry 6, Danny is very well written, and the female Danny's performance is fantastic. I tried male Danny during a preview event for the game for around 5 hours or so, and after comparing the two, I actually think that female Danny's performance is the superior of the two. She's funny, clever, and perhaps most importantly to her role as the player character, she's likable and relatable. And this is done in myriad ways, but my favorite has to be these fun, lighthearted moments where Danny will start to sing along to the music that you hear on the radio, such as this point when I was riding on a jet ski and Danny started rocking out to the radio. I can't stress enough just how much of an improvement this player character is over the last game. Far Cry 5 tried to take the route of a typical RPG instead of as a first-person shooter with an intense story, which is what these games have always been about. I mean, sure, they're also about gameplay and having a cathartic experience, blah, 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 but we'll get to that. Now, with that out of the way, the game opens up with a small bit of text on a black screen, giving you a rough rundown of the world into which we will be thrown. We'll be playing on an island in the heart of the Caribbean called Yara. Even though Ubisoft insists that there's no direct correlation, think of this as Cuba. The country was thrust into the slums of poverty after a revolution in 1967 left the government shattered and the country bankrupt. That revolution also saw the father of an individual named Anton Castillo executed by the rebels who claimed that they were overthrowing the established tyranny. Fast forward to present day, that man, who was a boy during the revolution, has now been elected as El Presidente and is on a mission to use a newfound cancer cure to rebuild the country. However, as we can see in the opening cutscene, this is not as straightforward as you might suspect. While it does seem at this point that Viviro is capable of curing cancer, and we have no reason to doubt that, its harvesting and production is extremely taxing and has led to the countless deaths that's inspired the revolution to which we will be joining. As these clips play, Anton Castillo, played by Giancarlo Esposito, explains that in order to build paradise, sacrifices must be made, and part of the way they will achieve this is with the draft to paradise, in which they will draft regular yarns into positions where they will be forced to farm and produce this cancer cure. Effectively, slave labor. Everything then transitions to the heart of the capital city within Yara. Denny is on a rooftop with two people named Alejo and Lita. Lita is a member of some sort of revolutionary group called Libertad, but we don't know much about it at this point. And Alejo is just Alejo. He's not really important. We're then presented with our ID card, which allows us to choose between male or female Danny. Once you make your selection, you see a tank pull up and call out a bunch of civilians on the ground below. They execute one of them for becoming belligerent, and this pisses off Alejo to the point where he throws a bottle and begins cursing at the soldiers, but that doesn't end well. Now with the soldiers chasing after them for their insubordination, Danny and Lita begin fleeing the city. They were already about to head off to a boat where they could leave the island once and for all, leaving Lita behind to fight in the revolution, but now with Alejo dead, Danny demands that Lita has to follow her. We don't know much about these two, but they seem to be friends, at least in some capacity. This opening bit serves as a movement tutorial and also a stealth tutorial, which surprised me. Far Cry 5 was not about stealth at all. It was an afterthought in every sense of the word. But in Far Cry 6, this is the first thing that they teach you after movement. They haven't even taught you how to use a gun, and they're already showing you how to avoid guards' view and use your environment to avoid detection. It sets up the very simple idea that in this game you will be playing as a guerrilla fighter, not as a run-and-gun mercenary. In Far Cry 6, there will be many times when the game demands that you play smart. And while this does lead to some issues that we'll discuss in just a few moments, it is refreshing and shows that they really did look at the gameplay loop within Far Cry games from top to bottom and reevaluate the whole thing. Regardless, once you've pushed through the city, you reach the dock, hop on the boat, and you board. Everything seems normal, but it's important to note that there's an old lady here who seems to be helping a young boy get on the boat as well, even though there isn't room for them at the outset. But since Alejo was unalived, to keep it algorithm friendly, there's now room for him. So they all get on the boat. You sail off, and I'm just gonna let this scene play out because I cannot do it justice simply by describing it. This will introduce you to Anton Castillo and give you an idea of the tone this game is going for.
To the young geese, Alejo gave you a fucking gift, Lira. We survive. Same as the orphanage, same as the academy. What's that?
Please, no, this is a peaceful boat. Dios mío, no!
Before he was El Presidente, mi papa loved to fish. We would go out on a boat, just like this, and we would catch the fish and then release them. He would say, it's not always about your stomach, mijo. It's about the challenge. Except when he caught a big that juicy marlin. You was too proud to let that fish go.
Si tirano! You have poisoned Yara! You have poisoned your soul!
I have caught a very big fish today. Haven't I, Diego? Diego!
No way.
I have caught you, mijo. Now it's time to bring you home.
I don't want this anymore, Papa.
We have no choice.
Let them go. They can work. Make Viviro.
Truth or lies?
Truth.
They could be good workers. They could help rebuild paradise. But if you wanted them to live, you would have never set foot on this fucking boat. 13 years old. And Diego has such compassion for his people. These fish, we will catch and release.
What the hell just happened?
We're fucked.
¡Vamos, vamos!
Danny!
Danny wakes up on a beach surrounded by dead bodies and finds Lita, who is moments away from death. Lita shares with Danny some information that will introduce her to Libertad's leader, Clara. Moments later, she dies. Danny stands up, finds a machete, and you are welcomed to Far Cry 6. Now, after Lita's death, Danny isn't strictly motivated to stay behind on the island and fight El Presidente. She even has dialogue shortly after washing up on the shore where she says that her plan is still to get on a boat and leave immediately. However, as I'm sure you would expect, she's going to realize over the next few hours that if she doesn't stay behind and help the rebels, she won't be able to live with herself. After all, this is her home. Everyone she's ever known and loved lives here, and many of them are still trapped under the oppressive thumb of El Presidente. She has a unique set of skills as well, having been a member of the military, making her a very valuable asset to the resistance. And a quick side note, I really appreciate that they wrote in a reason for Danny having skills with guns and combat tactics. It's a small detail to throw in, but it helps the player take all of this a little bit more seriously. Games that don't exert the effort to properly explain what the protagonist is capable of doing take the form of something like Fallout 4, where if you play as the female character, you are navigating a post-apocalyptic war zone as a lawyer and new mother. I'm not joking, that's her background in Fallout 4. And we all know how immersive that game was. Also, can I just say I love this logo reveal. It's punchy, dramatic, it's the Nicolas Cage of intros. I love it. Now, what does this introduction tell us? Well, it sets the tone immediately. This is going to be a much darker, grittier, and grounded story than we saw in Far Cry 5. That game really didn't take itself too seriously. I mean, hell, there were entire sequences where you were drugged out of your mind and they basically got away with a bunch of supernatural stuff going on by simply saying that it was drugs and leaving it at that. But this time around, the game opens up with mass executions and expertly written monologues delivered by Giancarlo Esposito. I mean, for real, what more could you possibly want? And speaking of Anton Castillo and his son Diego, they are both fantastically well written and performed even better throughout the entire story. My only complaint is that we don't get to see more of them, which could be because they were trying to keep their exposure more minimal to keep a lot of this up to your imagination and let you fill in the gaps, but more likely it's because he was very expensive and they had to keep the budget somewhat within check. And yes, I said them. I want to see more of them. Diego, played by Anthony Gonzalez, is almost just as captivating on screen as his father. Their relationship is a complicated one, with parallels drawn all over the place. The clearest one being that Anton's father died in the 1967 revolution when he was 13 years old, the exact same age as Diego, something that they bring up a few times. And as this revolution rages, I think that Anton knows where it's going and that his son will be set up to follow in his father's footsteps, whether he knows it or wants it. And I often found myself looking forward to their scenes together more than Anton's solo scenes, which is not something I expected. In parody with this, the monologues are very well crafted. I won't spoil it, but I will say that there is one scene in particular later in the game that's around 3 minutes long and contains only 4 words. And it's possibly my favorite scene of the whole game. Giancarlo knows exactly what he's doing, and it shows. So I'm glad to report that the great monologues we all knew and loved for so long in Far Cry are back in full force in Far Cry 6, and they are better than they've ever been. But these monologues aren't strictly relegated to the main cast. Sub-characters also get their chance to shine, and some NPCs do as well. Take this example. This is right after you wash up on the shore at the beginning of the game. Again, still the first 20 minutes or so. The very first enemies that you encounter, and the first ones that you will kill, are standing over the dead body of a rebel that they've just executed.
I can smell it on your clothes. Your sweat. It's the stink of a traitor. All rotten on the inside. How did I know you were scavenging for Ubisoft? I smelled it on you. That's why you died. Now, I'm going to call this in. You're going to be slowly eaten, bit by bit, by the birds and the crabs. You're just meat to them.
Now, in most first-person shooters, the guards would just walk around the body and their thoughts and motivations would be left up to your imagination. Your level of immersion would determine whether or not you actually felt as though these people deserved to pay with their lives for what they'd just done. But in this case, we hear this female soldier talk to the corpse, pontificating upon her disdain and contempt for her victim. And I'll be honest, after hearing everything she said here, I didn't feel as though Dani was taking an unnecessary step in killing the soldier to continue on her way. In a game like Uncharted, you could say that Nathan Drake should have pushed around and avoided the confrontation for sake of ludonarrative dissonance, but in this case, I think Dani is completely justified in avenging this poor man's needlessly gruesome death. And this furthers the idea that the story is felt throughout the world. It's felt in the art, the NPCs, and the small discussions between the supporting cast and Dani. This theme of revolution echoes across the entire island. The first one was, of course, in 1967, and it's become legendary in local social circles. Those who participated in it, or are lucky enough to remember the time at which it was occurring, speak fondly of it, which is interesting considering it was also a time of war, during which many of these people lost friends and family members. And this is likely contributing to the romanticized attitudes that characters such as Clara and Juan present regarding the current revolution at hand.
You're a guerrilla, and for a guerrilla, the shit my pants rush of an ambush, the smell of sulfur burning your nostrils, it's
fun.
Now, in my mind, this is the most important part of the game's design that makes it stand out as a Far Cry game and not just another generic shooter. I can't get too specific about story beats later in the game, but this is really well done, and they really did stick the landing. This is so refreshing compared to some of Ubisoft's most bland and uninspired worlds over the last few years. This world is competent and feels as though it actually works alongside the story's themes. But it's not perfect. I won't spoil it, but there are some really awkward moments with some of the supporting cast. You can tell they were trying to flex their modern sensibilities with some of these plot lines and characters. Seriously, I don't know what it is about these big studios trying to be hip like the cool kids. Maybe they've always done this, and at this point I'm just an old and cynical 24-year-old and I don't give these things a pass even though I should, but I can't help but feel as though these things are really cringy.
Who are you? We're La Moral, and the Este is our land. Our land, our medicine. You practice that little speech? Yeah.
I really don't know to whom they think this appeals, but I think for most people it just sits weird. It just comes off as a bunch of 40-year-old men trying to appeal to the young, vivacious youth. That, and I know that there are kids that just got out of college that dress and act like this, so maybe some of Ubisoft's newer employees actually find this type of thing relatable. I really don't know, but what I do know is that I don't find these characters likable even though they're young and within my age demographic. It just seems too pandering, and it actually achieves the opposite of what I can only assume is the intended effect. But like I said, I'm willing to accept that this is just my personal frustration and not the experience that everybody's going to have. I do, however, stand behind my criticism that there are a lot of story beats here that aren't executed well and are incredibly heavy-handed. Even plot points that should be a celebration of diversity and inclusion find themselves mired in the sludge of panderistic writing and corporate marketing double talk. All of this is made all the worse with the added context of Ubisoft's workplace harassment accusations that compound this situation and really make it seem as though these aren't true attempts to add inclusion and diversity for their own sake, but rather attempts to appease the more vicious members of the gaming journalism community. But enough about the story, let's talk about the gameplay. The basic gameplay loop is very similar in structure to that of Far Cry 5, at least in the broad strokes. There are 3 basic provinces that you're going to be pursuing over the course of the game. Each of these have 2 high-ranking targets that work within Castillo's inner circle. Eliminating each of them will weaken Anton Castillo's hold on Yara and thus make it easier to infiltrate Esperanza when the time is right. You're also going to be trying to recruit allies in each of these provinces as well. Once you've won over these allies, they're going to help you eliminate those aforementioned targets within each of their respective provinces, and eventually will provide Libertad with much needed support during the final assault on the capital. It's a tried and true formula and establishes a very simple structure for the game. In Act 1, you're clearing the beginning island, around 5 hours. In Act 2, you're going to be clearing each of these 3 provinces, around 5 to 6 hours each. But note, if you try to do a completionist run of each area, you're probably spending more like 10 to 15 hours in each of them, especially if you consider all of the hunting and fishing challenges as part of those provinces. And in Act 3, you're going to be making the final push on the capital, trying to defeat Anton Castillo and take back Yara once and for all. And I'll give Ubisoft credit where it's due. They've always been really good at setting up long-term goals for the player to motivate them as they explore the game world and engage with all of its available mechanics. Sometimes it's a bit unrestrained, such as in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where the moment you arrive in England, you'll see that you have to clear an entire country through a process that will likely take you 70 to 80 hours. At this point in Far Cry 6, you don't actually know how long it's going to take you to clear each province. And that's okay. A little bit of mystery never hurt anyone, and it's best to set goals for the player to achieve first and then have them evaluate their time management skills later. Now, within each of these provinces and areas, as you attempt to clear them, you're going to be engaging with a few basic gameplay systems. Things like gunplay, crafting, various mini-games, exploration, and co-op all contribute to the mix. To begin, let's discuss gunplay. At the center of this system are the weapons, and I'm glad to report that there's a ton of variety here. Pistols, submachine guns, rifles, RPGs, sniper rifles, shotguns, and even an assortment of crazy Dead Rising-esque weapons all combine into a collection of some of the most varied and well-built weapons that I think have been present in any game over the last few years. There's a few swings and misses in here, and I would argue that certain classes of these weapons are less viable over the course of the story than other weapon types, but That being said, there's variety, and that's a good thing. I myself experimented a lot with the weapons and crafting system that's paired with it over the course of my time with the game. By the final act, I had settled on my favorite loadout of all. A blast round MP7, a silenced tactical rifle, a second tactical rifle, not silenced, but rather loaded out with high velocity armor-piercing rounds for breaking helmets and getting quick headshots. And for my fourth weapon, which was my sidearm, I settled on using an incendiary round-firing pistol that I could use to ignite Viviro clouds, which, by the way, is a super cool mechanic. I was able to throw gas grenades and then ignite the cloud with this pistol, and that made for some really cool dynamic combat moments. Furthermore, resolver weapons and Supremo loadouts, crafted thanks to Juan, are some of the more fun and unique weapons that I've seen in any shooter in recent memory. My favorites were the stealth nail gun rifle that was great for clearing out bases early in the game without alerting anyone, and the fireworks rocket launcher that did high damage while also being fun to look at. These were all really fun to use and thankfully, and much to my surprise, felt like actual weapons that could be crafted by some resourceful guerrilla fighters. I'll be real, when I first saw these things in the trailers, I was a little skeptical. It looked way too Dead Rising for me, but they actually feel really good, and the design is put together well enough that it feels like these things could actually exist. For the most part, at least. But just because the weapon variety and loadouts are pretty good doesn't necessarily mean that the combat is always going to be the most robust. I encountered a lot of bizarre damage issues and inconsistencies. For whatever reason, a lot of the damage reception for enemies felt off. For instance, when I was clearing this weather station early in the game, I landed multiple shots on the sniper and it didn't do so much as slow her down. And then when I was hitting headshots shortly after this, I still wasn't seeing them take effect, and it took 3 or 4 shots to wipe someone who wasn't even wearing a helmet. I understand there could be something such as damage fall off or damage reduction at play here thanks to the armor the enemy is wearing, but in this case there was no helmet, and as I said, I'm using a sniper rifle from around 100 meters. There is no reason that this shouldn't be an instant kill when it connects. And I get it, not every game can be or should be Escape from Tarkov and leave you dead after a single shot to the thigh. But at the same time, I think the player should be rewarded if they're good enough to land a headshot square between the eyes, even if it's from 100 meters, or perhaps especially if it's from 100 meters. But time and time again, the damage fall off or the armor type was strong enough to prevent a bullet that landed on the face from dealing damage. Even if they were wearing a helmet, I don't think this should be allowed. This is 2021. You should be able to have a hitbox that takes account of the face and still applies protection with the helmet. But I will say I only noticed this early in the game, probably because I hadn't figured out the loadout system and specializing certain weapons for different playstyles. Later in the game, when I was using that aforementioned headshot tactical rifle, I didn't have this issue at all, because the loadout was built in a way where it would eliminate any sort of armor that was on the head, so regardless of headset protection, I still dealt the damage needed to incapacitate the enemy. So perhaps it's not even a bug, and rather it's a feature. It's meant to force the player into a position where they need to craft out weapons specializing in dealing damage with headshots, or body damage with shotguns, or whatever else it may be. But the point is, in my mind, if the player perceives something as an issue, it's an issue, even if it was intentional. If the player thinks it's a bug, there's something going wrong. Paired with the gunplay are the amigos, and I was really excited for these things after seeing the trailers that hyped them up so much. And while each amigo does have their own unique set of skills that makes them feel as though they should be really useful for certain playstyles, they really didn't feel as fleshed out as a gameplay mechanic as I thought they should be. Directing them to certain targets was only ever really useful as a distraction while trying to stealth around enemies, even the amigos that are built out specifically to deal high damage, or survive certain poison effects or fire effects, such as the K9000. Unfortunately, during combat they became an afterthought, as I had much more pressing things to consider than where to send my wiener dog. So instead, I just ended up selecting my favorite amigo for cosmetic reasons, and largely ignoring them during combat, full stop. But a system I did use a lot was the crafting system, which is something you're going to need to engage with if you want to have any sort of fun with Far Cry 6. As I've already mentioned, there are various different ammo types that deal different damage based on armor sets, where they land, etc. Certain damage types are useful for vehicles, for instance. As I mentioned earlier, I had this MP7 built out with blast rounds, which allowed me to break cars apart like they were made out of wet cardboard. Or you can use incendiary rounds, as I mentioned, or rounds that deal poison effects, or high velocity rounds. It really is up to you, and that's the point of crafting systems. Now within these menus, you're going to be crafting different attachments for certain weapons. You can find legendary builds of different weapons in the game world that can't be customized at all. Effectively, they're like blueprints that are fully loaded out and you can't change them. But the ones you can change can be crafted using items you find in the world. Thankfully, it's not done with just generic scrap. Certain craftable attachments will require different types of materials that have to be found in different areas of the map. And if you're missing certain items that you need to finish crafting that one suppressor you've been waiting for, you can often trade things such as fish or animal meat for the items that you're missing. I don't have much to say about this other than that it's nice to see these systems interweave, because now there's an actual reason to go hunting beyond just achievement hunting. You see what I did there? Now, speaking of the hunting, what other types of missions and quests can you go on in Far Cry 6? Well, of course, there's the main story missions. These are usually the blockbuster ones with the highest production value, where the coolest stuff happens. Beyond this is the side content, such as map clearing with eliminating checkpoints, anti-aircraft artillery, and the like. But there's also a lot of mini games and side activities that can keep you busy. Things such as hunting, fishing, races, cockfighting, dominoes. There's also these half games such as the Bandido operations, which are not something I expected to see here. I won't go into it in too much detail here, I'll wait for the critique, but basically this is a choose your own adventure type of mini game, and other than the real world timer that limits certain activities, it's not bad. But all of this only works if the world is designed in a competent way. So what is the world of Far Cry 6 like? Well, the most direct comparison I can draw is Just Cause 2. Not only are the games set in very similar locations, but also tonally, they're pretty similar. There's an all-controlling tyrant, he has this island paradise, he's trying to turn into an actual paradise, but he's doing so at the expense of everybody beneath him. There are NPCs and civilians in the world, but for the most part they just go about their days doing their own thing and don't really respond to what you're doing, and mostly just fade into the background. They do notice certain things going on around them, such as complimenting Chorizo and your other amigos when they're introduced, but I never really felt as though the civilians were really living and breathing. For the most part, the world is populated with enemies and military patrols. And since you're going to be spending a lot of your time going through the main story, dealing with a lot of these encampments before you go and engage with the side content, I think most players probably aren't going to notice just how stacked the world is in terms of civilians to military. But as we saw in the opening, this is a country that's under the control of a tyrant who keeps rounding up the civilians to put them to work on these farms to harvest viviro. So there's an actual in-game explanation that does make sense as to why a lot of these houses and apartments are abandoned. All told, the map really does feel like it belongs in Far Cry, but in a refined way that's less about checking boxes off and more about keeping the player engaged with varied content. There are still bases to clear, checkpoints to lift, and gear to acquire, but the game focuses on using the player's level as the impetus to clear these things instead of mandating a set number of objectives be completed. For example, a story quest may recommend that you're level 12 to complete it, but if you're level 10 at that point that you're presented with the quest, you'll need to complete some Stories of Yara quest lines, clear some enemy encampments, or other such activities in order to level up. Granted, it's mostly a cosmetic change since you're still being asked to clear the same areas you would be otherwise, but this way there's more choice as to which area to clear, and that being left up to the player's agency is what I'm praising here. Furthermore, Ubisoft went to extreme lengths to pay attention to detail in a lot of things going on in the game. One of the stupider examples I could point to is early in the game when I was running with Juan. We had just met and I noticed that there was this annoying clapping sound, and it was almost like a clicking while we were running through this trail. I thought it was some sort of audio glitch, or maybe a fan in my PC was freaking out, but after I'd taken off my headphones and investigated and found nothing, I put my headphones back on, resumed the game, and realized that Juan was wearing flip-flops, and the developers went to the trouble of adding in the sound of the flip-flop flip-flopping on his heel. It was fantastic attention to detail that almost drove me crazy.
So, how did you get to this godforsaken hellhole?
I was on a refugee ship. We didn't get far.
Yeah.
Furthermore, they've taken a lot of things into consideration, especially if you happen to finish and complete quest objectives before they're required of the player. For example, if you happen to destroy one of the anti-aircraft cannons on the starting island during the tutorial section, when Juan asks you to destroy it in preparation for the final mission on the island, Danny will inform him that it's already been taken care of and you don't have to do it again.
You get that chopper up and running?
See, but there's an anti-aircraft cannon blocking the airspace around Castillo's warships.
Keep up, old man. Already took it out.
Careful, Danny. You're starting to sound like a real fucking guerrilla.
Which is a nice change of pace from some of Ubisoft's older games, which would just reset the objective so that you would complete it again so that the main story questline could be padded out with the maximum game time. It's these little touches that help the world feel real and your actions meaningful. I just love that they paid this much attention because it's not something we've seen Ubisoft do very much in the last few years. But the game wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. I did run into a number of technical issues that I think are worth mentioning. Before I do so, I feel the need to explain what I was playing the game on, so that if you have similar hardware, you know what to expect, and also so you know I wasn't trying to run this game on a potato and then complaining about the graphics. I mostly played the game on PC with a 5950X and a 3080 running off of an M.2 NVMe SSD. I did test the game on my Series X and S, and I didn't find any of the following bugs or eccentricities on those platforms. It seemed to run a lot better on Series X and S, but that could also just be my particular PC, driver issues, etc., that might be remedied at launch. I should also mention that the game is also going to Xbox One and PS4, and I didn't test the game on those platforms, but I can't imagine your experience would be anywhere near as good as if you were playing on one of the current gen systems or PC. And this is a game where the improved frame rate, the enhanced graphical fidelity thanks to HDR and other similar technologies, and faster load times all contribute to a much better experience. Straight up, if your only option is to play this on Xbox One or PlayStation 4, I would probably hold off and wait till you have a newer system. Your experience is going to be a lot better. Now, I ran into a handful of what I would consider to be very low impact and unimportant bugs. These are things that happen all the time in all sorts of different games and really don't affect the experience other than a quick double take, chuckle, and then moving on and forgetting about it. But that being said, I did have a couple of severe bugs that caused the game to freeze up and forced me to reload. This first time, I really don't know what happened. I was coming out of a cutscene, it faded to black, and it simply never faded back in. I really don't know what happened. It just didn't. I sat here for like 20 minutes and nothing happened. I tried pressing buttons, waiting, smashing escape. I tried doing any number of things to get it to unlock, and while the music played, Nothing happened. So I had to Alt F4, restart the game, and load back in. The other issue I encountered a few times was bad enough in a couple of occasions to force me into the same position where I had to reload to get it to reset. This happened when I was doing one of the dead drop missions for Juan, where I needed to deliver some cargo in a plane. So I got in the plane, flew to my location, landed on a beach, and hopped out to deliver the package. But when I hopped out, I couldn't move my field of view, like at all. My mouse just wouldn't do anything. Didn't matter if I hit escape, pulled up menus, did anything, shot around, it didn't matter. I couldn't move my view. I was forced to look in this one direction. I tried plugging in an Xbox controller. No difference. Unplugging the controller, going back to mouse, that didn't do anything. The only way I could get this to fix itself the first time was to hop in another vehicle and have it reset. But in this case, because of the angle my camera was stuck at, I couldn't actually hop inside the plane to reset my field of view control, or whatever you would call it, so I was forced to reload to the previous autosave. Now, while this really isn't that big of a deal on the grand scheme of things, oh no, I had to reload my autosave and I lost 2 minutes of progress. I still find this type of thing unacceptable. If you sell any product and it forces you to hard restart it to get it working properly, that's unacceptable. I don't have any tolerance for this type of thing, and as a result, I'm going to have to penalize the game in its final rating because of it. The other technical issue I encountered was the enemy AI. It's pretty inconsistent. There's moments where they pull off fairly complex flanks and maneuvers against the player, working together to come at you from different angles, using poison grenades and then throwing other grenades to ignite it. And the different enemy classes work really well together, with medics reviving other NPCs, laying down suppressive fire with brutes, and using all of their different ammunition types to keep the player on their toes regardless of what armor they're using. But there are smaller details to artificial intelligence in this case that have large impacts, which are important to mention. For instance, one of my favorite weapons in the game is this nail machine gun, like I mentioned earlier. It's silenced, so it makes a great stealth weapon for clearing out encampments, and it also has a ton of ammunition, making it a lot more viable than a silenced tactical rifle, at least in the early game. However, it isn't the most accurate weapon on the planet, meaning that from larger distances, it's very likely that you won't land the headshot on your first attempt. Often this means that when you miss that first shot, you just spray the enemy with an additional 3 or 4 nails to take them out quickly before they can alert everybody else. However, and I can't believe I have to say this, nails hurt a lot if they're shot directly into your chest at extreme velocity. And so, while I can understand that a headshot would incapacitate somebody before they have the chance to exclaim or scream, I think taking a nail to one's abdomen or chest would likely cause them to scream or perhaps exhale within the first second or two that it happens. But what happens with the nail machine gun is that you can shoot out 3 to 5 of these things and the NPC won't make a damn sound. It's a small detail, one that probably doesn't bug most people, but for me there are many times when I was torn out of my immersion because 2 characters were standing near each other and one took 5 nails to the back or chest before they died without making so much as a squeak to alert the enemy next to them. Again, it may not bug you, but it really does get in the way of immersion, and more than anything, it just left me hoping that we get a new Game Plus hardcore mode in the future that takes all of these things into consideration. But all of this brings us to the conclusion. Listen, I've really enjoyed my time with Far Cry 6, way more than I expected to, and to be honest, it's really surprising to me that I've enjoyed my time with it so much based on how much I disliked Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which was their previous major AAA, arguably quadruple A release. And while the game is not perfect and the tech issues and dumb AI detract from my experience, I can't help but feel as though this was a great step forward for the franchise. And in the face of other releases Ubisoft has had recently, it stands as a great game that's worth your time. In fact, after playing through Far Cry 3 and 5 in the last few months in preparation for this game, I'm happy to report that after much consideration, I do indeed consider this to be the best game in the franchise, both as a game and narratively. Seriously, Giancarlo Esposito nails it, and so does his son Diego. I don't want to spoil or show any of the scenes later in the game where they really get to shine, but trust me, you'll be glad that you experienced it yourself firsthand without any spoilers. However, because I encountered a game crash and other bugs that required a reload, I must deduct from its final score. For that reason, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10, and I recommend that you play it on PC or next-gen systems and skip it if you're playing on Xbox One and PS4. But that's it for me. Make sure to subscribe right now. Seriously, press the button. It takes 2 seconds. See? Wasn't that easy? Okay, no, now I know you didn't actually press the button and you were just waiting for me to finish my spiel. Go ahead, press it. These videos take a lot of that. Yes, there you go. Seriously, press the sub button to get notified when the main critique for the game comes out, where I'll dive into everything the game has to offer. And once again, thank you for subscribing and watching my videos. I love you all more than you could possibly know, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.